Welcome to Groups This Week. As a church, we exist to help all people become fully devoted followers of Jesus. We believe doing life together is a crucial part of that journey. During this time, we're going to unpack and dig deeper into the sermon we heard this past week. Let's dive in as we continue to grow in our faith, knowledge, and love of Jesus together.
Well, hey, and welcome community groups. Welcome, Sam.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.
Christmas is coming.
Yeah, it
very
is.
soon here.
Well, Sam, we were taking a look at Matthew chapter 2 this weekend. You spoke.
Story of the Magi.
Yeah, verses 1 to 12 here. And I think as we just look at this text and we're looking at the Magi, what can we learn from the way that God speaks to those who aren't yet worshiping him or following him, because that's the story of the Magi. What can we learn about the way that God speaks to those who don't yet know him?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a cool picture of God calling the least expected guests to the birthday party of Jesus, right? Yeah. And so I think sometimes we miss that because we mistake who these Magi were. I grew up in church and on the flannel graphs in Sunday school. Like, I always imagined the Magi, and I think it was even taught to me that the Magi were these good guys, these humble kings who were coming to the manger and were offering what they had to Jesus. And there's aspects of that, but these weren't kings, and even wise men is a pretty loose translation. A better translation would be magicians, right? A closer word to Magi is magicians, and not like an illusionist like Shin Lim or a Vegas act Penn and Teller or something. Yeah. These were astrologers. They were looking to the stars to find the answers to life's biggest questions. And so all of Israel would have seen these guys as idolaters. Like maybe we could think of like mediums or tarot card readers right? And so these were not the guys that people were expecting to show up at Jesus' birth. And yet God went on this pursuit of them. God invited them. And so I think right out of the gate what we see, and this is cool in Matthew's gospel, it's kind of bookend in the very end of Matthew's gospel, and we quote this often, there's this great commission to go into all the world and share the gospel with everyone. It starts in Matthew chapter 2 with a great invitation of the nations to come to the birth of Jesus. And so I think we see that God, in calling the Magi, he also uses what the Magi are looking to call them towards himself. And I think there's something there for us, is that God uses whatever has our attention. So for them, it was stars. I don't think what Matthew's saying in this is look at the stars, right? Is that's where you're going to find. No, but I think he's making a powerful point. These guys were infatuated with the stars. That was their whole life. And so God would even use that, what was considered idol worship, and point that towards himself. And I've seen that to be true in my life, and I'm sure everyone has a story of that, of God using what had your attention to point you towards him.
Yeah, what a gracious God we have, that he knows us better than we know ourselves and speaks to us in ways that we can understand.
Totally.
Yeah, and I feel like that is a great question for groups, right? Hey, like, how has God spoken to you in ways that you've understood to draw you to himself, or for him to teach you about who he is?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And in my life, music was a big way that he did that, right? And so I always thought that I was just going to be like a traveling musician playing in bands, and that was a big part of my life up until my early 20s. And when I was a kid, so much of my life blew up, and kind of as I was transitioning into high school, I was previously homeschooled, which probably makes a lot of things make sense for people watching. But I was homeschooled up until grade 9. In that moment, everything kind of crumbled. My youth pastor left our church. My parents got divorced. There's a massive moral failure of a leader I was following. And everything that was in my hands was kind of falling away. Yeah. And God used music, the only thing I cared about it way more than I cared about God. He had that lead me to him, and here's how. Some friends were playing in the youth band, and they were like, "Sam, would you want to come and play music with us at church?" And I was like, "Sure," not because I wanted to worship God with my talents, but because I wanted to play music. Yeah. And then I showed up, and they needed a worship leader, and nobody else sang, and so I started leading worship. And before I was even convinced I really believed, while I was still angry with God because of my situation and how my world had fallen apart, he was using this to call me towards himself. I was sitting through youth services and leading worship at conferences.
That's crazy.
And he used that to call me towards himself. And so I think everybody has a story like that. For me, it was music.
Yeah.
For other friends, it's like they were pursuing. A recent friend that I've made was pursuing witchcraft and the occult and these experiences, even with like weird drugs and things. And God met them in the midst of one of those kind of hallucinations and experiences they had an encounter with Jesus.
Yeah.
And man, I just think that shows the grace of God.
So good. Wow. Yeah, like super applicable from the Magi to us today and how God intervenes in those ways. As we continue to look at the text, like we see there's kind of like, the scribes, and then we've got the Magi, and there's like contrast in how they maybe understand God, pursue Him. Can you I
think this is actually one of the saddest parts of the story for me. Is so just for context, and maybe read through the passage together as a group. But the Magi get to Jerusalem looking for this king. Yeah. And so they talk to Herod. They say, "Where's the king of the Jews?" He gets all kind of uptight. He calls in the scribes. "Hey, what does the scripture say about this king they're talking about?" And so the scribes unpack the prophecies of old, that he's going to be born in Bethlehem, and give them all the information they need to go and find the king. But the scribes don't go. They know everything. They know where to find him, and yet they stay in Jerusalem, just kind of doing their thing, continuing to wait.
Man.
And so they miss Jesus. And I think there's like a pretty stark warning there for us, that we can know Scripture, we can be like immersed in Christian community, and yet still miss Jesus.
Yeah.
And so I think what I want to do is I want to posture my heart like the Magi, these ones who are willing to risk everything to go, these foreigners who are willing to follow the star to Jesus, rather than being the scribes who know everything intellectually and they know where to find him and they can point it out to others. And I mean, I see this temptation in my own heart, where I can like unpack the original Greek word and what it meant, and I can exegete a passage of scripture, and then so often find myself not doing what Jesus says.
Yeah.
It's like I know what he says to do, I can teach on what he says to do, and yet the words he says about simplicity or about generosity or about the way that I should interact with my neighbors, or I'm so quick to not do those things.
Yeah.
And so it's like, God, I think one of the prayers that I have coming from this text is like, would you help me not just to know the word, but to do the word?
Yeah.
Would you help me not just to, even in this Christmas season, not just to recount these beautiful moments throughout the Christmas story, but to encounter the living, risen Jesus through this season.
Man. Yeah, like I even think of, what's that verse in, is it John 5, where like Jesus is talking to the scribes and the Pharisees and saying that like, you search the scriptures because you think that in them you have life, but it's like Jesus is the one who offers
they're
life.
All pointing to me, and you're missing it.
Looking through the scriptures, but missing the one that it points to.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
We can easily do that too, right? What a gift the scriptures are, but they point to the God that we worship, right?
Yeah.
Well, I want to zone in as well on joy. So we see that the Magi, when they look at this star, it says when they saw the star in verse 10, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy.
Yeah.
And so what does it look like for us to experience this kind of joy that the Magi did?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a link there with kind of posturing our hearts like the Magi, these ones who are longing for Jesus, are going to Jesus, experiencing him. I think there's a link with what we see them do. So they come, they experience exceedingly great joy as they encounter Jesus. And then they bow down in worship, offering their treasures at the feet of Jesus. And so I think if we want to posture our hearts like that, if we want to avoid this kind of cynicism and intellectualized faith and of the scribes and lean into the posture of the Magi, I think it's cultivating joy.
And how do we do that?
Well, it's one thing to say, it's to say like rejoice and be glad. And it's like, well, how do I do that? Yeah. So I think there's different ways that we see both in Scripture and through church history, and maybe even just exercises, practices we can do to cultivate joy. One is being intentional about gratitude. And a couple of weeks ago at staff prayer, a gathering that we do weekly as a staff team, Marty led us through an exercise I found so incredibly helpful of it's almost like a way of examine. But looking past the last, week, month, you can do whatever you want. But it's just like thinking through it and saying, God, where were there moments of joy? Because it's so easy to breeze past those and to dwell on the negatives.
Yeah.
It's so easy, especially with the news cycles and social media, but like there's so much negative in our world and so much that's, so it's easy to dwell on those things, but instead to recap, God, where were these moments where I experienced life and joy, and maybe writing those down. And so since that time, just in the last few weeks, I've been trying to start days like that. Start my day rather than thinking about like all the craziness of the day or what's going on in our world. It's just like, hey, what are a few things I'm thankful for from yesterday? And for me, it's like generally small things.
Yeah.
Like a moment that I had with my daughter before going to sleep.
Yeah.
And just like a question she asked me and the joy that brought, or a conversation with a friend, or like I'm doing a coffee advent calendar thing right now.
Cool. So I thought coffee would come up.
Dude, yeah. And so this morning I had like one of my favorite cups of coffee I've ever had. I think it was from Montreal. It was at a place called Traffic.
Wow.
And it was this incredible cup of coffee. And I'm like, man, that just brings joy. And so remembering, taking an inventory of these moments, the small things, and then also I think meditating on the goodness of God. You can meditate on the cross of Jesus, that he would give his life for us, and read those passages of scripture. I think our emotions often follow our thinking.
Yeah.
And so just paying attention to where our mind is going, and then meditating on the things that are right and true and good, on our future hope, as Revelation 22 talks about, of this age to come. And so I think those are some places to start. I think celebration, we're going to talk about this in our
rhythm
series
right?
coming up. I think cultivating lives that include celebration is huge. Actually marking special moments and looking back. I was recently with a friend who nearly died a year ago due to some crazy health challenges. And so a year later, took a moment, gathered close friends around, and we just celebrated that he's alive, that he hasn't passed away. And that in itself is a way of marking moments with joy, right?
Yeah.
And celebration. So I don't know, that's just a few thoughts.
That's awesome. And I think it just really highlights that like the God we worship is not anti-joy.
No,
right? Like
he's the source of all joy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
sometimes we can get this idea that he's a killjoy, or
No.
that our faith is just about following rules and you know don't have any fun. But it's like God is the God of joy. Like he created this emotion.
It's so good,
you know,
Ryan.
and you know, following him leads to joy.
He
our
wants
joy.
you to feel happiness,
Exactly.
and joy. Absolutely.
Well, I feel like this would be a great practice to try, what you just mentioned, doing this joy catalog that we'll throw in the discussion guide. And then maybe another question that you guys can discuss is, what are things that you found to cultivate joy in your own life and walk with Jesus? So thanks so much, Sam, for sitting down with us. And we hope you have a great conversation, groups.
We'll see you guys later.
We hope you enjoyed the teaching today. If you're wanting to follow along with our community group's discussion guide with your group, you can head to cachurch.ca/media, where you can find the discussion guide. Not only are there questions there related to the sermon, but there's also prayer prompts that relate to the passage or the topic that we were talking about, and practices that you can, on an individual level or a group level, begin integrating into your life to not only bring this knowledge into your mind, but to begin living it out.